So, this talk, I want to talk about how the government is going to make money. And when I say the government, I mean the Confederation. So, before I get into that, all of the authority from the government is derived from, ultimately, it's derived from um, the Deus Ex Machina theory that I originally started writing about years and years ago, over a decade ago, which has finally started to reach a consistency that it's something that I can start committing to paper, and eventually I can formalize it, and then it'll be polished and it'll be done. But the Deus Ex Machina theory of what is real um, defines what is real, what is true, and what is good. And it does that by assuming that integration is valuable and that therefore anything, its central axiom is that integration is intrinsically valuable. That there's an intrinsic infinite worth or an absolute worth to integration. That anything that integrates, therefore, is valuable, and anything that disintegrates or causes disintegration is not valuable and should be avoided. So that things that are considered real, true, and good are integrated or cause integration, and things that are unreal, false, or evil are things that cause disintegration or are disintegrated. Then the constitutions of the empire, of the confederation, of the federations, and of the syndicates, all the political structure is an application of that Deus Ex Machina theory. The same theory is used as a premise, and then the next premise is that we live here, that there are humans, that there are these nations that have these laws, all of the present day settings that will have relevance and bearing on the way that things work. And so, taking all of that into account, the entirety of the Deus Ex Machina theory as premise one, and the entirety of the human condition at present day conditions as premise two, we then draw the conclusion that there needs to be this constitution, and this constitution then needs to discern how to apply that theory that has already defined for us what is real, true, and good. This constitution will then tell us how to specifically do that in this real world that we find ourselves in here. And so that's a more specific application. So it's more concrete. And the empire is the largest scale that has to deal with anybody that agrees with the Deus Ex Machina theory. And so the Deus Ex Machina theory is then kind of the defining line of itself and of the political application of itself. So that those who believe in it are part of the empire, and those that don't believe in it are not. And then, of course, you have to consent. So you have to actually manifest that by moving within some physical contiguous boundary of the empire. And the empire is dependent upon the center of itself, that there has to be a contiguous non-zero limit that these laws manifest, even if it's just one person. And then you've got a radius around that center, and that's the empire. It can only occupy a finite space and time, but it's and that's necessary, because if the empire weren't limited geographically, then it would apply to everyone, and then you would never be able to escape it. So there has to be consent, there has to be a choice not to do that. And so then there has to be a limit to it. It has justification. The empire has justification itself only in the field of anti-modality, because the theory is made in such a way that you've got anti-modality, which is in the field of subjectivity. The field of modality, which is also the field of all possibilities, that's the Confederation scale. And then each of the federations are centered on each of the three absolutes as the lowest scale. And then the syndicates go even further, and they determine the specific ways that manifests in 3D reality, in these objective arrangements. And it parses reality into those three-dimensional blocks, and then treats each three-dimensional block as a data point. And it says that either that data point is real, true, and good, or it is unreal, false, or evil. And that's how it defines what the application of that theory is in real life, in little three-dimensional chunks of just frozen, snapshot of three-dimensional space, of all the objects, the people, and everything in that space. And that's what's being identified when someone identifies an act. That's done at the syndicate level. That's the final application that goes beyond the constitutions and all that. And the syndicates, because they are an application of the federations, the federate laws, they don't have to be absolute because they are centered on the absolutes. The federations do have to be absolute because they are defining what the application of the Deus Ex Machina theory is to this world, the present human day condition, according to this absolute value of, whichever absolute, nothing, indiscernibility, or being, depending on the federation. And so there's then a line, a relation in between the present human condition and that specific absolute value, 0, 1, or infinity, respectively. And that's the absolute value from which we measure all of those three-dimensional slices as deviations from that absolute. And that's how that is, precisely measured to an absolute degree of precision, meaning that it can't be any more precise. The syndicates then, they don't have a correspondent scale, I guess, unless you wanted to repeat it, in which case they would be at the antimodal level, describing the field of all impossibility. So they would be there to blacklist illegal acts that have been discerned to have been committed at least once somewhere in the surveillance footage, and that act is also not a normal act that is typically committed in that area. So it then compiles a list of all of these illegal acts, building a field or an anti-field of impossibilities. So, or in this case, illegalities, which is the politically applied version of impossibilities. They're analogous. They're related to each other in that way. And so each syndicate, which is about the size of a city, is part of a state, which is the federation, and those states are united under a confederation. sort of like the state of Colorado is part of the United States of America. In that same way, the federate state, I keep calling it a state. It's not a state because states, like I said, are illegitimate because they don't change dependent upon what the population does, which is not true of any part of the empire. But the syndicates are where all of those 3D blocks of blacklisted acts and all that stuff, they all correspond to a 66% majority of the population in any given contiguous volume of space, to the point where there's at least 3 enclosed spaces in which acts can be committed. There's at least 3 independent volumes in which acts can be committed in a syndicate. So it can be as small as 3 enclosures or 3 rooms. And it can be as large, a syndicate can be as large as the combination of all of those volumes within the federation that they're a part of. But they can't exceed their federation for the same reason that there's that dividing line between Colorado and Nebraska or whichever other state that doesn't want to sell pot or doesn't want to abide by Colorado's rules or laws. So analogously, there's a state line, only this time it's not a state, so it's a syndicate, a federate line in between each federation. And each federation corresponds to one of the 3 absolutes. So a syndicate that's inside of the federation of nil, which is correspondent to the absolute of nothingness, a syndicate in that federation would not be able to grow so large that it exceeds the federate limit in between the federation of nil and the federation of I, which has its absolute as indiscernibility, I. So there's a jurisdictional limit and there's a geographical limit of contiguity. And contiguity is extremely important. This is where things start to operate kind of like the game Go, where if somebody captures a volume by surrounding it on at least 4 out of its 6 sides, then it becomes captured. It becomes part of the larger contiguous volume that grew around it. So that's how syndicates kind of form, and they're fluid, so they can overtake each other, they can be absorbed by each other. There can be nested syndicates within each other that get increasingly more specific and increasingly more subculturally pure, I guess, and diverse. And eventually they reach a point where they're so ultra specific that everybody in there is basically interchangeable with everyone else because they have so much in common that they're almost carbon copies of each other. That's how specific it can get. In reality, it probably won't ever reach that level because by the time that somebody was just surrounded by a bunch of carbon copies of themselves, they wouldn't really find that much of interest, I would think. So they probably just wouldn't do that. But they could do that if they wanted to do that. Because of the fluid way that this is being determined, which is to say that there's just certain acts that either are or are not committed in these nested syndicated volumes. Syndication being that you reach at least 66% homogenization of actions so that you have developed a normal trend, a pattern of actions, and that constitutes a culture, and it also constitutes law. So that if somebody violates that, then they're not only responsible culturally, which would make sense anyway, because you're going to be socially ousted because people can't trust you because you've broken the norm, you've broken the tradition, you've broken the predictive ability for other people to predict what you're going to do next. So then they can't trust you. All of that is natural. So none of it ever gets forced on anyone. That's just something I have noticed is just part of nature, part of the way that people interact with each other and integrate. And it isn't specific to humans, it's just the way people in general interact with each other sustainably, is that they integrate into these communities in which they develop norms for their actions. So what that does then is you've got a scale from empire, which is the closest to anti-modality, which is just a collection of all the impossibilities. So its language is going to reflect that. And it's going to be very subjective also. So it's going to be a manifesto, more or less. It is a constitution, but it's going to have the spirit of a manifesto because it's basically establishing the baseline cultural no-nos. Like, we don't ever do this. No matter who you are, no matter where you're from, no matter what you're like, you don't do this. You don't lie. You don't cheat. You don't steal. You don't murder. Stuff like that. Those are all going to be included as imperial crimes in the imperial constitution, and that doesn't require any consent. Those are acts that no one could ever consent to because they're necessarily non-consensual. They're beyond non-consensual. They have some problem that is so bad that they could never be consented to. Those are imperial crimes. Those are crimes like mass censorship or recontextualization, where you deliberately misinterpret the author's intent to suit your own needs. And that's an example of that would be like Dr. Peterson and what the hell is her name? That one chick that was always saying, so what you're saying is, and then she would follow it with some stupid, crazy ass misinterpretation, some feminist dogmatic bullshit, which obviously wasn't his intent. It's just how she wanted to view the situation, given the extreme liberty that she's taking with the way that he is speaking. It clearly shows to me that he means X, and she clearly to me violates that and says that he means Y. That's recontextualization. When somebody deliberately misinterprets your language so that it makes it look like you're saying something is being implied when you didn't explicitly state that, or it wasn't your implication anyway. Like, yeah, you were trying to imply something, but that wasn't what you were trying to imply. Or it goes too far beyond what you're saying and it's overly exaggerated, or some slippery slope fallacy is thrown in there to skip over a whole bunch of details that the opposition doesn't want to pay attention to, and basically straw manning the other person's argument in a nutshell. Those types of things are so detrimental that you can't consent to it, because that's like the Stalinist regime, where you become so intolerant of any opposition that everything becomes opposed to you. And that's kind of like exemplified through Stalin's death, that no one even went into his room for, I think it was like an hour after he died, because they were all afraid that he would have blamed them. Oh, he choked me, or something like that. And because it was so arbitrary, because there was no integration of norms or understanding or predictability, it was completely unpredictable because it was all whatever Stalin said. And Stalin wasn't a predictable man. He would go one way and then go somewhere else, or he would come up with an idea that makes no sense and has no logical validity at all, or use some empirically unsound tidbit that isn't actually real, didn't actually happen, and then treat it as if it were real. You know, the party saved all these people, or whatever it is. So it's a crime that is so bad that you cannot consent to it. Stalin-esque coercion methods, where the law of the state is so unpredictable that no one can follow it, and things like that. Those types of crimes are imperial crimes. Those get laid out in the imperial constitution. That's the biggest, largest scale. And all it does is it just blacklists a whole bunch of that type of thing, mass censorship, coercive oligarchic regimes, things like that. The next step lower than that is the Constitution of the Confederation. The Confederation is where it starts to define what is consensual, what is personhood, and what is an act. What is the definition of actually committing an act? And that's where you get to the point where it's talking about volumes and syndication and the majority and normative acts versus aberrant acts, stuff like that. But it doesn't define which acts are considered aberrant and which acts are not, except for the imperial crimes and any crimes that are not consensual or violate someone's personhood or are simply impossible because they violate the definition of what an act is. So those new crimes are a little bit more specific. They're a little bit lower in scale. So these are more, I would say, they're not quite at the national level. They're more at like the regional level, I guess, but maybe national. So it establishes things that basically everybody can follow, but you might not, but it's pretty low probability. The crimes that the Confederation is going to explicitly say are not crimes that most people would advocate for committing. It would be things like rape and theft and murder and stuff like that, only on an individual level. Instead of it being like Stalin, where it was mass genocide, now it's just murder. And then when you go down another step further in scale from Confederate, which is murder, rape, and theft, you get down to the Federate level. And that one starts to get specific enough that it resembles what most people consider to be political in nature. And that's when it starts to determine how consent, personhood, and acts are measured. For example, the discernment between who is a child, intoxicated, insane, and there was a fourth one, or a criminal. That one changes between each federation, so that now there's not just one set of rules. Now it depends on which federation that you're in, and they change depending on which federation you're in. So each of them has their own set of laws. And those laws are all, their authority is all coming from which absolute value the federation is founded upon, that it's analogous to. So just like how the empire is analogous to the field of anti-modality, the Confederation is analogous to the field of modality, or the field of all possibilities. And the federations are correspondent to, or analogous to, the three absolutes of nothing, indiscernibility, and being. So that's how people can check to ensure that the government is actually performing what it's supposed to be performing, and that it's doing so at a proper rate and all of that. The properness of that rate is the similitude between the actual acts that the government commits and the absolute value of 0, 1, or infinity. And it will just depend on which federation that you're in that determines which value that is. So what that causes then is an ability to measure exactly how much deviation there is from that absolute value. For example, in the Republic, what the government is doing overall is measured by how little and how close to zero, which is analogous to nothing, which is analogous, analogous to the federation of nil, which is, of course, or analogous to nothing, the absolute of nothing. So how well it does is determined by zero crime, zero deaths from medical malpractice or inaction, and zero violations of consent in, I don't know, a cultural way. So basically, no evil, no falsehood, and no unreality, unempirical, unsound data points. It will predict things and they will happen according to those predictions. It will say that certain things happened and those things that it said happened actually did happen, and it doesn't allow for things that would compromise either of those two things. So that's the Federation of Nil. But then there's the Federation of I, which has the absolute value of 1, not 0. So instead of it talking about there being zero crime in the government of the Federation of I, it's more about, is everything integrated into one unit? So it's not exactly the same measurement. The Federation of I is going to have its measure of 1. The Federation of Nil is going to have its measure of 0. So their measurements on how well they're doing as a government is going to change depending on which one we're talking about. So the Federation of I is not necessarily trying to reduce crime to 0. It's not necessarily trying to reach a 0 point because its value is not 0. Its value is 1. So it's always trying to get everybody to integrate into a unity. So it's looking for homogeneity rather than an absence of bad things. It's looking for an integration of all things. And then you've got the Federation of Being, which is going to focus on the absolute of being, which is going to focus on increasing, I guess you would say, consent. So the Federation of Nil is going to focus on not having personhood violated. The Federation of I is going to focus on not having consent violated, and the Federation of Being is focusing on not having acts violated. So that's how those three governments would operate.